Is the Charter of Rights and Freedoms truly a Canadian document, or is it actually more American?
Trudeau, in making his constitution with the Charter of Rights and Freedoms and setting up the Supreme Court the way it does, he made us far more American than anything that's ever happened before. And for the court to even hear this is absolutely shocking. This will create a serious constitutional crisis at a time when places like Alberta, where I live, we're already deciding whether or not we want to stay in Canada. And quite frankly, I think this is just one of the many hundreds of reasons why we probably shouldn't stay in Canada.
Concepts with Shawn.
Welcome to Concepts. My name is Shawn Watley, and today we have Dr. Matthew Rowley with us. He is president of Training Leaders International. He wrote his thesis on the tension between church and state in Upper Canada. So he's gone super deep into this issue around how our theological presuppositions impact our political outlook. And so we go fairly extensively into his thoughts on how that plays out with respect to Alberta independence, Canada, the nature of rights in Canada, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and so on. We start our conversation looking at the current, what I'm calling a revolution going on at the Supreme Court of Canada right now in Ottawa, this Friday today, March the 27th. And the Supreme Court is debating whether or not it should put limitations on the Notwithstanding clause. So as many of you already know, the Notwithstanding clause, or Section 33 of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, allows provinces to say, hang on, we're going to go ahead and do this bit of legislation, even if the courts decide that a particular bill is unconstitutional. And this is what's been going on in Quebec around Bill 21. Bill 21 is a kind of a militant secularism where Quebec has said, no, you can't have any religious symbols if you work in the public service. And we could debate what we think of that. But at the same time, it's also a bill or a bit of legislation that goes 100% against multiculturalism. It says, no, we're not supporting multiculturalism in government, in public office. So fascinating debate going on. But the federal government is trying to intervene in this case and amend the Constitution, potentially, depending on how the Supreme Court rules. But they're trying to amend the Constitution without using the amending formula. So they don't need to get provinces to approve of this. They just need the Supreme Court to approve of it. And of course, the Supreme Court, most of them there, have been appointed by Liberals. So we had a long discussion about that and how that relates to legitimacy, good government. What's the nature of government? What's the nature of public good? How do we determine that? Where do we place our bets when it comes to determining the best way to govern society? Should a government tell us what to do, or should communities figure this out on their own? As usual, I had an awful lot of fun here. Dr. Rowley has thought deeply about this and has a passion for Canada and for good governance. Now, he thinks that Canada's gone too far and there's just no way for Alberta to remain because Canada doesn't seem to show any interest in wanting to treat Alberta fairly. So we had to talk about that. Hopefully, I've convinced him that maybe all hope might not be lost, and maybe there are more friends in the rest of Canada that want Alberta to stay. Certainly, I'm one of them. However, I do have a soft spot for this line of thinking. I don't blame Albertans and I guess people in Quebec when they start talking about separatism as well. That should put the onus on the rest of Canada to say, tell us what you're thinking. Why are you thinking that way? And how can we fix the problems that make you feel that way? I think I have a fairly good sense of why they're thinking that way, but I think the rest of Canada doesn't. And so I hope that doesn't sound too arrogant of me to say that. But thanks again for taking a moment to watch or listen to this. If you are able to, simply click on like or subscribe. It makes a huge, huge difference to the show. And I'm really looking forward to hearing what you think in the comments. So let's get on with it. Matthew Rowley, welcome.
Hey, it's great to be here with you.
I reached out to you asking you to solve a whole bunch of my problems, and you said, "Yeah, sure, I'd love to." So you have to invoice me at the end of this for answering all my problems. But I just wanted to start with your thoughts on what's happening right this week in the Supreme Court of Canada hearing the case on Bill 21 out of Quebec. So Quebec has been using the notwithstanding clause to say, no, we think it's perfectly legitimate to legislate secularism. So no religious symbols allowed in the public service. And they've done it over and over again. And at first, actually, I thought, oh, maybe, I don't know if I totally like that. But then on reflection, I realized, well, actually, they're legislating against multiculturalism. And so lo and behold, Mark Carney is one of the interveners, the Mark Carney Liberals, one of the interveners at the Supreme Court, saying, no, we need to change this. We need limitations. Forget about the amending formula. We're just going to change the Constitution directly. I'd love to get your thoughts on this whole fiasco going on this week.
Yeah, well, definitely. It is a crucial case. I'm shocked that the Supreme Court even took it on. The idea of being asked to rule on whether they can strike down essentially the notwithstanding clause when it doesn't agree with them is egregious. It is silly. It's stupid. It's going to take away from the authority of the court by making them clearly political. And, for me, I look at Quebec and I say, I might not do things the way Quebec does, but Quebec is their own province. And they have the right, according to the Constitution, to use the notwithstanding clause. And the deal that made the Constitution possible, which, by the way, Quebec still hasn't signed, so it's not even like they have to follow any of the rules anyway. But the deal that made the Constitution possible was the notwithstanding clause. And it was to preserve what has always been the British tradition, the legislative supremacy. We should not have, and I emphasize should not because the reality is we do. We should not have court supremacy, the ability of the courts to strike down laws or to mandate that the government has to create a law on this, that, or the next subject. That is alien to our form of government. It's funny, people always attack certain groups and say, oh, they want to be American. Well, Trudeau, in making his constitution with the Charter of Rights and Freedoms and setting up the Supreme Court the way it does, he made us far more American than anything that's ever happened before. And for the court to even hear this is absolutely shocking. And unfortunately, I expect that the court, they're being asked to rule on whether they should have more power. If the court hadn't made some of the decisions they've made in the last 15 years, I'd say, hey, no problem. They're just going to slap the government upside the head and say, of course, the notwithstanding clause is constitutional. But I actually expect that this court, with the track record it has, will probably try to rule that the notwithstanding clause can be limited. And this will create a serious constitutional crisis at a time when places like Alberta, where I live, we're already deciding whether or not we want to stay in Canada. And quite frankly, I think this is just one of the many hundreds of reasons why we probably shouldn't stay in Canada. But here we have the court saying, yeah, we will even rule on whether we can unilaterally amend the Constitution. While for years, Alberta has been saying the Constitution needs amendment. And they say, no, we wouldn't even dream of doing that. So, yeah, I think it is on this side of the notwithstanding clause and on the side of provincial rights, this is egregious. Then we move to the idea of secularism. I think, I personally think Quebec is going the wrong route, right? They're trying to follow a more French idea of laïcism, right? Where there is a government standard of militant secularism. Now, the logic behind it is to try to preserve the unique Quebec culture and all of those type of things in the face of multiculturalism. So I can be sympathetic in that sense. I think there's probably a better way to achieve that, and it actually requires addressing the issues of multiculturalism directly on. But Quebec is very good at finding ways to tackle multiculturalism in ways that they have control. And they do quite an interesting job of playing with the Constitution and playing with their relationship with the federal government to achieve their ends. So I'm sympathetic to them. I think the court is just silly in what they're doing, and it will further erode the legitimacy of the Supreme Court for sure.
Really? You said they should not have the authority. So just that comment, should not, speaks to legitimacy, sovereignty. And we're going to get into that in a second. I'm going to put a pin in that, put it off to the side. But I'm glad you made a few comments about Alberta. And I would love to just hear you dilate on that a bit. Barry Cooper was just on, and he said, he's the, I guess, Canadian leading voice on regional myths or self-understanding, how people in the prairies see themselves and see the world versus how people see themselves in Laurentian Canada or in the East Coast. So I wonder if you could share some of your thoughts. Again, only if you feel comfortable. I don't even know if I gave you warning about this, but you brought it up. And Barry Cooper, also my most popular video so far, just a couple weeks ago, he said, no, it's not a question of if we separate, it's a question of when. He said these myths are irreconcilable. So do you take that strong of an approach? And is this something that's going to happen no matter what happens in the Supreme Court this week? Just dilate on that a bit more.
I do agree with Barry. I think he said it very well. We may or may not win the referendum that'll be coming in the fall here. I do actually hope we do. I think that Canada and Alberta will get along better as friends and neighbors than we do as a married couple, as it were. I lived in Ontario for 2 years while I was doing my PhD, and I came away from that experience realizing we are two different cultures, and neither culture is bad. Having a culture, having a way you do things, having a general milieu in which you live, these are not bad things. But when you try to hold together a culture or a series of cultures that are different, and then especially when you have one culture that has the supremacy and feels that it has the duty to mandate its way of viewing things or its way of doing things, you create tension. And what we've encountered from the very inception of Alberta, 120 years, is the attempt of the East to impose upon us certain ideas or values. I was just reading last night about Lougheed and the fights that he had with Ottawa. And so often it was a case of two completely different views. In Alberta, hey, we finally are starting to make a little money from our oil field. While in Ottawa, they're saying, oh, look at those rich fat cats out there. It's about time they started to pay their fair share for all the rest of us. And you see these different values and understandings, even though beyond that, socially, simple mindset things. I grew up in a farming community. I'm a fifth generation Albertan. When we have our guns are not there because we expect to, hold the door against a horde of burglars who are going to kick it in and take our stuff. We use our gun as a tool. Many of us every day, whether it's to protect our livestock or to get rid of critters that are destroying various things, or to hunt, to feed our families. We see our firearms as a tool. But when you're in downtown Toronto, it's very hard to understand a world where a firearm is a tool. You go to the grocery store for your meat. You don't go out into the bush and get it yourself. And it's that divide where the one can't let the other live in peace that really is the problem. I put a lot of the issues actually at the feet of Pierre Trudeau and his constitution. And the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which was not about giving us rights, because we already had all the rights that were there. It was actually a way of placing those rights within the realm of the government and the Supreme Court and adjudicating those rights. And it was about control. And since the institution of the Charter, we have seen Canada pushed to a very different place, not because Canadians wanted to go there, but in spite of popular opinion a lot of the times, in spite of what the legislature would have done. But the courts were used to force things. Right now, the latest thing for us was the fact that, in the midst of Alberta trying to build its economy, the Supreme Court could say, well, because there is a climate crisis, the government has the right to institute a carbon tax. That's just an insane point of view, quite honestly. So we have these differences between us, and there is no way to reconcile those differences, I believe, because I don't see any desire on the part of what Barry would call, and I would agree, the Laurentians to change things. It's not that the normal rank and file people of Ontario or Quebec have much against us. They're probably more confused than anything, but we see a deliberate policy on the part of the Laurentian leaders to try to force Alberta into a mold that it doesn't want to go in. Here when we say the government should be smaller, almost everybody in the province says, hallelujah, let's have more of that. Where in Ontario and Quebec, there's actually far more of a love for government. Interestingly enough, I put it down to how we were settled. You go to Ontario and Quebec, they were settled by the government, and people were given rations, tools. They were provided for and protected by the government in a very real way as they built their provinces. And they built amazing things. Nobody can question it. If you wander around Ontario and look at these gorgeous stone houses, or you go to Quebec and you see Quebec City, I mean, these are beautiful places that people have worked for generations to build. That's great. But they built it with support from the government. The government was always there to backstop them. Alberta was built by a bunch of people who got here before the government did. My family came in 1898, and they quite literally showed up off of a railroad and went to a homestead and started hacking into the bush. And if they didn't provide for themselves and for their community, they would be lost. There was no government there. There was no insurance. There was no welfare state. So the Alberta ethos is the government actually causes problems, get them out of the way so we can do things. And there's an ethos more in the East where the government is actually, providing the chief provider or one of the key providers for a good life. And that's a big difference that we have that I don't see we can reconcile.
Yeah. Well, number one, Canada would be much worse without Alberta. So I hope you guys fail in your separatist attempts. I'm desperate without you. And I want you to know that you have friends here. So you mentioned 1898. My family came in 1904, and we moved to the Lakehead, Northern Ontario. And I often tell people, my great-grandfather moved with, I think he had 13 kids, into a chunk of swamp and bush. There was no road, no hydro, no nothing. Like, you had to trek across land. Nobody wanted this place, just rocks and trees and mosquitoes. And then he died and left my great-grandmother with 13 kids. It was just a disaster. And they'd spent all their money, I guess, to get there. And your comments about guns. Yeah, guns are tools. But I share that to say, now I'm living north of Toronto. Andy Crook says, yeah, you're living there for your sins, Shawn.
That's right. Yes.
But we very much, at least in rural Northern Ontario, we did not expect, even today, even now, we don't expect the government to show up and help us. My parents still live in an unorganized township. They don't have garbage collection. I mean, they have snowplows and things. But just to let you say that, civilization doesn't end at the Saskatchewan border. There are good people beyond there that we have your side. And I'll end with this too. You talk about guns and protecting yourself. So I don't have any firearms with me down here, but I grew up with guns. But lo and behold, just literally 3 days ago, maybe it's 4 days ago now, I go down to check the chickens. We have chickens. We have like 17 acres here. We're only 8 minutes from a Costco, so we're not remote. But I go down, and the door is, the man door in the coop is ripped open. And I thought, oh, did kids get here or what? And then I look more closely, the lock itself has been ripped right out of the shed, and the trim is ripped off. And the whole barrel, I have a barrel full of feed, has been carried out of the chicken coop. And I'm looking around, and I see these paw prints, pretty much the size of my finger, just up to here. And so I tell my farmer friend, and he says, oh, yeah, there's been a bear around. Well, we don't get bears down here. Right. So now I'm thinking, oh, I need a gun. Like, They're going to eat all my animals. So we put up electric fence. I only tell you that story for you and for the audience to know that, yeah, in rural communities, a gun is a tool, and it's a
Yeah.
tool to
Yeah.
protect your livestock and so on. Now, I wanted to you drop the shiny object of the Charter, rights and freedoms, and given your background in political theology, as soon as you say rights, you start thinking natural rights, natural law, where did these rights come from? And I'm just wondering if you want to dilate a little bit on that, because it seems that, and you also mentioned big government. It seems that there's a version of conservatism that is very comfortable with the welfare state, very comfortable with big
Mm.
government. So I warned you that I try to drop 3 or 4 questions at the same time so that you don't feel trapped. So feel free to dilate on rights, the Charter of Rights. Why are some conservatives during the pandemic, we were saying, these are my charter rights. And I was going, oh dear, what are you saying that for? So rights, natural rights, rights achieved simply out of our reason versus, developed over 2,000 years of history. Could talk about the size of government, the welfare state. So continue to develop those themes, um, either from your training or from your perspective as an Albertan.
Yeah, I think first of all, I will say it's one of the reasons why I'm engaging with the independence movement is I do see too much uh, unpleasantness towards the average Eastern person. And one of the things I appreciate of having lived in the East is though I see a different culture, I don't see bad people. I don't see people who are the problem, right? Ottawa is the problem. The person in your town is not. And that's an important distinction to see that sometimes gets missed. When we're hurt and we're frustrated by the pain that's happening, and certain people vote for certain people, and we're left kind of holding our heads, going, "Why?" If you look at Ontario, it actually looks pretty blue sometimes, right? So just to confirm to you, I think that there is an unpleasantness that shouldn't be there towards the regular person in the East, and I hope to change that. I want to be friends and good friends with those who are good friends with us. On the charter, I think one of the key things that we see is traditionally in our Western political theory, there has always been the rights, the rights of an Englishman. Runnymede was the confirmation that the king is not above the law and that the rights of an Englishman are even for the king to respect. The law must be respected by everybody. And that is a vital idea that has always been present. But also present was the idea that with every right comes a responsibility. And again, we look to Runnymede. The king might be the king, but the king has a responsibility to rule well. And if you do not carry out the responsibilities that are inherent in the rights that you have been granted, you're in danger of losing those rights. And unfortunately, that piece has been lost by governments and by common people. The idea that we carry a responsibility towards those around us that go with our rights. Now, it was twisted and perverted. We saw during COVID, there was this idea that we can force you to conform to our image of whatever we want to do because, well, you have a responsibility to your fellow citizens. And it's like, hold on a second. There's actually a balance here, right? And you guys have gone so far off the cliff that you can't even see it. You're going to be locked into your house indefinitely by the government because they've decided that you're at risk. Well, that's not what we're actually talking about in rights and responsibility. But as a whole, that's one of the deep weaknesses that we've seen is the lack of an understanding of the responsibilities that come with being a responsible member of society. And so often we see people championing, screaming about their rights. But then when you ask them, what is your duty towards others? They say, well, I have none. And even like Bruce Party loves to, talk about two consenting adults and basically anything anything two consenting adults do is okay. And for me, I say that's totally wrong because those two consenting adults live within a community and the things that I do affect those around me. And it's why the beautiful unwritten British Constitution is so important to me because it keeps us from just being a legalistic society that follows the narrow laws and takes everything to court to get it litigated, to determine whether something is constitutional or not. The question should never be, is it constitutional, but is it good and is it right? And those are vastly different things. Mandatory minimum sentences for child rapists. Is that constitutional? Well, no, that's cruel and unusual punishment. But is that a good law? Yes, it protects people. So this is an important thing when we're looking at the whole area of rights and responsibility, that we have a duty and a responsibility to those around us. And again, in Alberta, we believe this because before the government got there, you had your community. And a community back then was everybody within your geographical area. And I think this is another area where we've gone so far off, is we've made our community, I'm part of this community, that community, the left-handed paper hanger community, the people who look exactly like me, think exactly like me, and we all gather on the internet. And you create this silo effect and this homogenization of thought that's damaging. We used to live in a community, which meant you had your crazy uncle over there and you had the weird guy on the edge of town over there. And all of us had to figure out how to get along, disagree, and still move the ball forward as a society, as a community. That's been stripped away and replaced by laws and rules. This Bill C9 that's come out, that hate speech laws. We didn't used to have hate speech laws, because if you said something to someone that they didn't like, you were liable to get punched in the nose. And it gave you a much more careful view of what you were going to say or not say. If you walked up to somebody and said, "Hey, I think your face is ugly," they might take offense. And there was no government there saying, "Well, no, you can't do anything like that." If you were mean to people, they might be mean back. And we've stripped all that away, so we've had to replace it with these silly laws that end up just being used by others to abuse. Once you place a law, it's only a question of time before someone finds the loophole and the way to abuse it. You were holding Oliver O'Donovan's Ways of Judgment there, and he's a political theologian and a political thinker that I love. And he says there should be fewer laws and more judgment. And in a society that is dying, it actually becomes the reverse. There are many laws. And the laws show that the society is collapsing because we're desperately trying to rule our way out of the problem rather than actually deal with the core problem. That's a whole lot there. You feel free to bounce on anything.
Oh, yeah, that's awesome. I've been writing notes as usual. And so a couple thoughts when you say more laws. I think, was it Tacitus who said the more
Yes.
the laws, the worse the people? And yeah, so whenever you see a place that's over-regulated, you start wondering, oh, what's going on here? You
Yeah.
mentioned Donovan's, the first line of his book. I just have to read it because it's awesome, and we could talk about it if you want. Quote, "The authority of secular government resides in the practice of judgment," end quote. And I have to come to my defense of Bruce Party, not to disagree with what you said. I actually agree with your comment. And something I love about Bruce, he's got a little book called Ecologic, Law, like logic. It changes the spelling of ecologic, but calls it ecologic. And he describes legal instrumentalism and how legal theorists, legislators think that they can pass laws to solve social problems. And he comes out very strongly against it. He says, no, we need a rule of law approach, which gets to some of the ideas you've been sharing about community and assumptions within that community. And as you were talking there, I couldn't help thinking also, I think it's Gottfried who said this, and he's quoting Aristotle about tropos and how the disposition of a particular people needs to match the nature of a particular regime. And when you have those two, you have tropos. They can work together. But as soon as the nature, the disposition of the people shift and drift, and, famous comments, I think John Adams said it about the American regime is only going to work if you have a people of faith or a Christian people. And so when you mentioned community and working things out that way without having to work out laws, the question came to me, you at the same time you said, but there are good things. You wrote down good and right. And so then I wondered, oh, wow. So are you now wanting to enforce your vision of the good? Or maybe you're a Straussian and you have a very crisp idea of what exactly is right and you're going to fight about it. So
Right.
just dilate a little bit on your thoughts on law, legal instrumentalism, good and right, and how muscular are you going to be? Are you going to go whack your neighbor over the head because they disagree on the vision of the good? So develop that a little bit and make us less worried that Dr. Rowley is just going to take power and enforce his vision on us.
Amen. Well, it's one of the beauties, again, not to harp on the beauties of the British Constitution, but we have 1,000 years of working out how the government should do good, where they have the right to intervene and where they should back off. And one of the key things that we see is government does not replace society. It is not the government's role to enforce good in every sphere. Classically, the role of government was internal justice and external defense. I point out, I was just talking to somebody else, and I pointed out King Richard II was considered good King Richard. He hardly stepped foot in England. He was barely even there. He was always off fighting a war or gone on a crusade. And yet he was considered good King Richard. Why? Well, because while he was gone, the king's justice still ran, and England had peace internally. And he was doing the other duty of a king. He was out fighting England's enemies. So though he was not present, though he never went on reality TV medieval style, though he was not schmoozing and glad-handing his way around the country, because he carried out the role of government, the proper role of government to provide internal justice and external defense, he was considered good. You look at his brother who took over after him, King John, who hardly ever left England, except going over to Normandy, and he was not good King John. Why? Because justice didn't stand with him. He was utterly unjust. He was capricious. He attempted to be above the law, and he brought about Runnymede. He brought about the Great Charter as a response when people said, hold on a second, you don't have the right to just do whatever you want. And I think that's true for our society. Ultimately, as a Christian and as a pastor, I say the heart is wicked and evil above all things. And so you're not going to make humans good without changing their hearts. So you cannot expect to create enough laws or build enough of a society rule that people will be forced into goodness. Anybody who has tried that in history has produced some of the worst abuses that we've ever seen. And that's not just from a religious standpoint, but secular too, right? Communism was this idea of we will force everyone to do good. The impulse that says, I will force you to do good, tends to produce the greatest evil. So we should have good laws, and there are things that everybody can basically agree is good. Hey, don't kill people. Basically a good law. Don't steal other people's stuff. Fair. You know what? That's my house. That's my property. You're not allowed to touch it. There are rules that are somewhat universal across law codes, across the generations, that provide a basic framework where people can thrive. You don't have the right to come and take my stuff or hurt me. Those type of things are good. When we start pushing into the realm of government telling us detailed good, famously the Commonwealth of England, a bunch of religious Puritans decided they wanted to create heaven on earth. They actually got to the point of mandating by law that you could wear no more than 2 colors at the same time, because otherwise that was ostentation. Well, that's just bloody ridiculous. And I'm saying that as a Christian believer who does believe that, it's good to live a certain way. The task of government is not to enforce detailed morality. Now, I do disagree with those who say you cannot legislate morality. That's got to be one of the dumbest ideas ever, because every single law is the legislation of morality. It is the definition of good and evil for the society. You can't kill people. That is legislating morality. There are societies where they think it's perfectly legit to kill people, and in many situations they will, and then afterwards they'll go and eat them. So we have to understand that law is the legislation of morality, but there is a level or a bar up to which it's okay to have universals for the society. And past that, it's dangerous. And the glories of the British Constitution and British society is we had a good level that things came to. Then we decided that, you know what, that's not good enough. Let's impose progressivism. Let's impose Enlightenment ideals. Let's impose all these things that will twist what we had 1,000 years to work on, and let's make it into something utterly new and experimental. And this is where we get these, Trudeau's Constitution being the biggest interposition on this, where we're changing the fundamental building blocks of how our society works. And it doesn't go well. So fear not, I am not an authoritarian. A quick note on Bruce. I do love Bruce. Bruce is one of the most sincere, detailed libertarians I've ever met. I disagree vociferously with Bruce and, can whenever or do whenever I can. But, it's good to see someone be consistent. And again, that's a problem that we have in Canada. If we believe things, be consistent and actually believe things. Both our main political parties seem to be far more concerned about getting elected than actually believing anything. And that, I think, is one of the reasons why we are in the serious situation we are in this country.
So I'm going to put a pin in the political parties bit, and we'll circle back to that at the end, because one of my main themes has been that we don't actually have much variety in our political parties in Canada, just versions of liberalism. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. But you left me a whole bunch of nice linking points for another question. Great answer, by the way. Sorry for not complimenting you on it. Unwritten Constitution, love it. Charter being a more continental French approach, Napoleonic, won't say French, continental and Napoleonic, just propositional. We're going to come up with a constitution and a charter, and we'll enforce it on the people. And King Richard being out of the country, love that. So, just internal, what did you say? Internal justice, external defense. Love that. So all of that, and in that you said, really, we have to emphasize people's hearts. So this leads to perhaps my main question that I have you on. So pressure, we're cranking up the pressure, Dr. Rowley. This is the crux right here. I've had this silly notion, and apologies for getting it wrong. This is your area of expertise, not mine. It seems that when you think of political theology, even if you're completely secular, even if you're an atheist, you have theological presuppositions that influence your political positions, your political theory. And so it seems to me, the messiness of the English Constitution, the notion that we have to work this out on our own in the community. Brian Alford says that, talks about a disputational nature of truth. We have to debate it and work it through. All of that works, I think, if you are sorting out, you mentioned earlier, rights and responsibilities. Responsibilities bring up the concept of ethics. There, you have a responsibility to do something. Ethics talks about right and wrong. So that battle, that ethical battle, that is always going on. For Protestant theology, it seems to put the location of that contest inside the heart of the individual. And this is where you're going to have to correct me if I've got this wrong. For Catholic theology, it seems to include the individual's heart, but also a huge helping of society. So Catholic social teaching, they have some fairly well-developed views on ethics as extending out into the society and out into the community, and some fairly clear ideas about what you should and should not do. So the battle, yes, it takes place in the interior castle, to use the title of Teresa of Avila's book, but it also is really worked out in the public square. And then the even further extreme would be the Jewish approach. And I'm quoting Dennis Prager here. I'm not sure he's a spokesperson for Judaism, but he said on a video, he said, I really frustrate my Christian friends. He said, for Jews, we earn our salvation. It all depends on behavior. And you've probably heard other spokespeople for Jewish people who are speaking in the political space where they say all that matters is behavior. And I agree in part. Don't talk to me about your intentions. Show me how you actually live. Don't tell me what
Right.
you hope to achieve in government. Show me what you actually do. So we've got three locations for this battle between good and evil: in the human heart, kind of in the public square, or completely in the public square. And it
Mm.
seems that it will lead to a different disposition towards politics itself. So you mentioned the Albertans are all angry. We're going to use politics to solve this solution. Well, it seems to betray the assumption that the real battle is outside of them. It's in the public square. It's in politics. We need to change the Constitution or something. Whereas a traditional or ancient Protestant approach would say, yeah, okay, well, we'll try, but don't get your hopes up because really the line between good and evil is in the heart of man. And
Right.
that's where we're putting our money. So I'm going to stop there. Hopefully, I've given you enough of a sense of where my problem is at or where my confusion perhaps lies. Tell me what I said that's completely wrong and then amplify on that if you want.
Yeah, I think we have two traditions, but it's not Catholic and Protestant. It's what I would call free church and mainline. Uh, so the free churches, the Baptists, etc., tend to have a strong tradition of the separation of church and state. And often you'll hear a Baptist or a Mennonite or those type of people basically say something along the lines of the government is not of God, or it's not the sphere where we should be working. It's all the heart. It's all let them do their thing. We're going to do our thing. The more Reformed tradition, Lutheran tradition, what we'd call mainline Protestant tradition, Anglican, would say, of course, the public sphere is very important. These were all churches that were established churches, established by law. The Anglican Church still is. King Charles is the head of the Anglican Church. So they have more of an understanding, like you'd say with the Roman Catholics, of there is a personal inner life of faith, and then there is a exterior social life of the faith. And I think we find that in James, right? The book of James says, you say you have faith. Great. Show me your faith. I'll show you my faith by my works. And it's not saying that works equals faith, like what you'd say, Dennis Prager, we have to work our way to salvation. But rather the result of the heart change that's supposed to happen as a Christian is now I will work for the good of others and care for others, love my neighbor as myself, and do good for those around me, pray for the peace of the city, etc., etc. So the impetus of what I would say, a healthy Protestant political theology is we need people whose hearts are right to be unselfish and to care for others truly because they want the best for them. Now, that doesn't mean I'm going to force you into my view of the best, but rather I am going to work for the peace of the city. The reason that we feel so strongly about this referendum is we need to decouple ourselves from a political ideology that is about the centralization of control within the federal government particularly, so that we can get the government out of the way. I love the way Jim Dinning said it just on politics. He said, government should be as hands-off as possible so that it earns the right to reach its meaty claw in and do something from time to time. And that, I believe, is a very Albertan point of view. But when we're looking then at the issue from a Christian or a traditional Christian point of view, we do need to be active as believers. I make the very uncomfortable point that people don't like. Western civilization is Christian civilization. Before Christianity, the West was a very different place. Germany was worshiping Odin and Thor and all these guys and had their sacred oaks. The British had the Druids and they were making wicker men and doing human sacrifices. Christian society, or Western society as we know it, flowed from the spread of Christianity and the way that changed culture across what is now Europe. And if we don't recognize that simple historical fact, we will have a problem. And the way I describe the problem is we look at Western civilization in this modern day and we go, oh, we love Western civilization. That's a beautiful building that stands and it looks so beautiful with all its little crenellations and turrets and everything else. But down there at the bottom is this foundation, and it's Christianity. And that's so boring and mundane. It's just basic. It's you don't really need that in order for Western civilization to look beautiful as it does. So what we're going to do is we're going to lift up this beautiful building that we call Western civilization. We're going to move it off of its foundation, and then we're going to allow it to hover in the air looking just as beautiful as it always does. And in fact, what's been happening is Western civilization is crumbling, just as any building crumbles when you try to remove its foundation. That is unpleasant for people. They say, well, yes, but that sounds very exclusivistic. I'm speaking as a historical theologian, as someone who looks at the past and says, how did this come about? And if it came about that way, then you have to say there must be a reason. It's why I describe myself as a true conservative. A conservative looks at the past and says, this is a plant that grew. And sure, you can tend it, you can prune it, you can adjust it, but you aren't in control of how that plant grows. Liberalism would say this is a mechanism, and if you don't like the mechanism, either fix it or tear it down and build a new mechanism. It's all cool. And that, to me, is the big difference between liberalism and a true conservative, which I would say I am, is a conservative values the dead of the past just as much as the living of the present and the people of the future. And we recognize that we aren't in control. We did not craft Western civilization in our own image, yet the last 120 years has been about trying to remake Western civilization and go down through all of the things that built it like it's a buffet. Oh, I'll take the rights. I'll take the freedoms. I'll take this. I'll take that. Ooh, but the responsibility, that's unpleasant. The duty to your fellow man. No, sir. The need to change the heart. That's awkward and not very open and tolerant. So we'll throw those pieces out and then hope that somehow we can continue on with Western civilization. And in fact, we're seeing such tension now because we have broken Western civilization. We've gone up to that beautiful living tree and we've taken an axe to half of the roots and said, you know what? We don't need that root, that root, that root, that root. And I hope the thing won't suffer. And right now it's looking pretty peaky and the leaves are starting to turn brown.
Yeah. Beautiful, beautiful answer. When you mentioned mainline versus free, Reformed, Lutheran, etc., I was thinking of Abraham Kuyper, and that's someone I've just started to read. And yeah, you're addressing this tension for me. Western civilization reminded me of the cut flower syndrome. We want the beautiful flower, but we don't want the roots, so we just want to cut it, stick it in a vase. But when you mention true conservatism versus kind of a liberal assumption that we're dealing with a mechanism that we can adjust, you mentioned a tree as well. I believe it's Aristotle that talks about us being more like an acorn. We're full of potential, but ultimately we're only going to grow into an oak tree. We're not going to grow into a rhubarb plant. And so that basic presupposition of what kind of raw material we're dealing with, I think, creates a very bright line, at least philosophically, between a conservative set of first principles versus liberal first principles. And to your point, it doesn't seem like, at least up until the last few years, people have been very interested in even having that discussion especially within Canadian politics. Maybe I'll just pause there and see if that sparks anything for you. And then I want to turn back to a few of your comments about Western civilization vis-a-vis O'Donovan. So any thoughts on the first principles presuppositions that people don't want to talk about?
Well, I think it's an interesting thing that we see in Canada where for a long time, everybody kind of assumed Canada was a Christian country. And what ended up happening was churches were fighting with each other over things that didn't matter. People divided themselves. Oh, I'm a Methodist. I'm a Presbyterian. What does that mean? Well, I go to that church. I go to that church. But I'm going to hate you for it because you're obviously inferior. And we created this false view where you didn't actually need basic core first principles, right? Anybody could believe whatever they wanted, and we're all playing nice, and it's going to be kumbaya, and it'll all be great. Because of the, what I would say, abuses, or because of the foolishness of Christian Canada, we lost what was really necessary in Western civilization. And so you had a generation who could say, well, we still have the basic morality of Christianity, but we don't need Jesus or, God in order to achieve that. Cool. And you had them living mostly moral lives. And then the next generation said, well, what is morality? Morality is a construct. And all of a sudden you had this residue of a Christian point of view that got less and less and less. And eventually you got to the point where they could say, you know what, your truth is my truth, or your truth is your truth, my truth is mine. A man can be a woman and the sky is purple. And this type of a change happened because we did not value and understand the past. And you're right, the potential is there in all of us, but we will only be human. We will never not be human. You can't change humanity apart from a heart renovation. And the government is the least capable of changing humanity in that way than any other. They have a role, according, if you go biblical, right? The role of the government is to wield the sword and make evil people afraid. And essentially that is the core principle of government, right? The monopoly upon force, the fact that they would provide justice internally and defense externally. They have a role, and the role is to provide a framework wherein people can either thrive or not thrive as they live their lives, as they carry out their potential. And if we don't respect that and recognize that, we will create problems. What happened as we shifted Christendom away from Christendom to this idea that Western society can live without God, we actually placed the state in the role of God. And it's the all-knowing, eternal, universal that is going to answer every problem, and that if you go and make petition to the government, it will be able to fix every need that you have. Well, where have we heard that before? It is this replacement. Now, again, one of the beautiful things of the British tradition is the king lives forever. The king is dead, long live the king. The government is not eternal. The government rises and falls, comes into being and ceases to exist as the king brings it into existence or not. And this provides us with a healthy perspective on government, that government is not eternal, all-knowing, all of the attributes of God. Government is merely an instrument of order. And if it goes bad, it can be dissolved and a new one can come along to fix it. That's, again, the beautiful thing. We don't need a revolution in order to dissolve the government and fix it. We just need to have a new parliament. And those type of things are valuable in understanding the position of government and the position of humanity in who we are and how we work. It's not all about some central beast, the Leviathan, as Hobbes would call it, that is, occasionally freighted with different human beings in and out like mechanistic pieces. We're actually a series of relationships right from the top to the bottom, and we need to work together as an ecosystem.
When you mentioned, well said, by the way, and when you mentioned government, changing government, one of my friends who's passed away now, people in the audience probably have heard of Bill Gardner. He's the founder of Civitas. You and I are both, you're on the board of Civitas. And he said, well, the great thing about our system, Shawn, is we kick the bums out. And I think if he was here today, I'd say, yeah, Bill, I agree, but do we actually change much at all? And he would say, well, that's what's wonderful about our conservative approach and our English Constitution, going back to Magna Carta and everything else that followed. And when we have changed Western civilization, when we've gone through a crisis, and this is leading up to a quote from a Donovan here, you mentioned power residing, a monopoly on force with government. Government also has to maintain a sense of legitimacy amongst the citizens. So I often use the example of stoplights. People stop at stoplights in North America. Other places around the world, they have stoplights and they don't even look at them. They'll go if they're red and stop if they're green. They just watch the traffic. So that sense of legitimacy is crucial. It's difficult to define. And if it's compromised by government failure, you think of the lineups at the passport office, we're in a much more serious condition. And so, in the introduction of O'Donovan's book, again, I'm not really endorsing his book. I'm very excited about it. It seems like I'm going to love it, but I can't say for sure whether I'm going to love it. But in his introduction, he talks about um, Western civilization going through a period of a crisis of confidence where churches were emptied and people really turned, it became irrelevant to what we were doing. And then he says this, then a renewed kind of focus on what society was about took its place, and that was emphasizing natural science, democratic politics, technology, and colonialism. And he says that the de-Christianization of institutions was followed by a rival crisis of confidence. He calls it a massive cultural certainty united natural science, democratic politics, technology, and colonialism. And that has fallen apart. World War
Amen.
II. Yeah, World War II showed us that no, we actually can blow each other up. And democracy can elect a Hitler. And technology maybe isn't good when you're 2 years old to look at a screen your whole life. And certainly colonialism, we do have some people saying, well, maybe it wasn't all bad. But certainly around the world, people have said it's kind of done. The British Empire ended in 1999. So given that, and given some of the, I would say, massive changes we've had since 2015, especially since 2020, are we in the midst of, I believe we're in the midst, I'll put it in the affirmative and you can tell me I'm wrong. I believe we're in the midst of a fundamental revolution in political thought where people are now revisiting first principles and saying, yeah, maybe technology can't save us. Maybe natural science does have limits. Maybe we can't trust the government. And that is scary because what ends up happening is a Nietzschean Übermensch, right? Will in power will come in and say, I'll save you. I think we've gone beyond just the collapse of Christianity. We're now seeing the collapse of secularism as a form of government. We're getting back to, Rusty Reno's book, Return of the Strong Gods, where nationalism and tribalism and various religions now have much more salience than they had in the immediate post-war era. So I've said a whole bunch of things. Does any of that spark thoughts for you vis-a-vis your comments on Western civilization?
Yeah, I think funny enough for young people now, young people always like to rebel against the norms. And their parents are the ones that said, we're secular, you don't need God, all this stuff. So now you have a huge resurgence of young people addressing the numinous, addressing the spiritual realm and saying, you know what, there might be something in this and, going various different ways. But I mean, I have seen more young people in church in the last 10 years than any time in my life. Because they, and not just young people who are sitting there, but young people who are interested in learning and knowing and growing and asking that question, why was it that our ancestors, that our forebears thought this was so important? And what have we been missing? They've experienced the emptiness and now they're coming back to something that might have more fullness. I talk about that with the Roman Empire. When Christianity first encountered the Roman Empire, it was a wealthy, polytheistic world where you could believe in anything you wanted to, have sex with anyone you wanted to, do anything at the end of the day that you felt like. And people felt empty. The lack of constraints doesn't make humans better. It actually makes them worse because the very worst of our natures comes forth. So along came Christianity and it said, the problem with you is internal and there is an answer, but you can't do it. God has to do it for you. And it revolutionized Roman society. It revolutionizes anybody that it touches because it demands for us to look outside of ourselves. It's the opposite of the Übermensch. It's the opposite of the will to power. It's the recognition of weakness and the need for one another and especially for God. And that does create a society that is caring, that is concerned, that is thoughtful, that will look to others as, hey, you're created in the image of God, so maybe I shouldn't just kill you or rape you or do all sorts of horrible things to you. It causes us to value people and to create laws that protect those who are minorities or those who have a different point of view than us. People forget that that's one of the great things about the Christian tradition is from a biblical point of view, from a standard Christian point of view, it is not the job of the believer to harm the unbeliever or force the unbeliever into line. And you see that throughout the history of the church, the willingness to tolerate when Christians are doing as they should, to tolerate others, not this nebulous tolerance that we see today where tolerance equals acquiescence, but rather the recognition that I cannot force you to be like me. I must instead win you. And that love for others is vital for Western society. And in Canada, we had a principle, Michael Binion talks about this a lot, and I agree with him, responsible government. This was one of those touchstones that actually created Canada. We said we are mature enough to be responsible in how we govern. And one of the duties of responsible government, again, the great British tradition, is, you know what, if you're a government and you do a bad job, you resign. If you're a minister and your ministry fails, you don't blame other people. You don't blame the orange man south of the border. You resign because you didn't do good enough and you take responsibility. We call our different members the honorable and the right honorable. Well, sadly, honor is not something that most of them would know. And I think that's a great indictment upon our present day Canadian government is those members used to be honorable. I love the old videos of Diefenbaker going after Trudeau or Pearson or whoever, because, man, that guy was fiery. And yet it was always the right honorable gentleman. There was still respect and decency and honor. You could attack the policies, but you had to respect and give honor where honor was due. And the reverse side of that is the person had to be honorable. And that too has been lost. In our present day government, you know, the great touchstone of Canada, in America, it was life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, this kind of nebulous, flowing pursuit of happiness. What does that even mean? But in Canada, it was very simple, very clear, and really not terribly aspirational. It could be achieved. Peace, order, and good government. That's all we want from the government, right? That's all we want from the Constitution. We want peace. We want orderly society where, like you say, everyone understands that the traffic light red means that you stop, and that way everyone has a simpler commute and there's fewer people dead on the side of the road. We want a government that is good, quantifiably. And these things are hard to put into some sort of a scientific standard. But people know, is the government good? They feel it in their soul, and you can see it when you talk to people. Like you say, there's this legitimacy issue, and we have stripped away the grounds of legitimacy on short-term gains. Government after government, conservatives too, unfortunately, or those who'd call themselves conservative, have stripped away the unwritten rules of governing in order to try to win short-term tactical victories, and we have strategically destroyed the greatness of our legacy of the British Constitution, where now everything is just a soundbite and a fight. I mean, question period is embarrassing these days. I love going and watching old question period or reading Hansard from back in, you know, the early 1900s, when, man, question period was good times where questions were asked, and now this is a foreign concept, but they were answered. And you actually had this true debate in the House of Commons. I love the story of MacDonald, who was about to be thrown out on his ear because of the scandals around the CP rail. And he goes into the House of Commons, gives a multi-hour speech, and by the time he's done, there's a standing ovation on both sides of the House, and he walks out in victory. Why? Because he debated them into the ground. That doesn't happen anymore. Nobody in that House, bless their hearts, is listening to each other. Forget about anything else. So we have been robbed of all of the things that made our tradition great, of all the things that made our government function, and they've been replaced with cheap, short-term gains. And you're right, we've lost all of the things that we were supposed to hope in. I love to point to 50s comic books. If you ever want to read fun things, read a 50s comic book that's talking about the future. And everybody has everything that's a pill. You know, if you want a meal, it's going to be in a pill. If you want this, it'll be a pill. They expected that they could solve all the problems of society through science and working hard. And yeah, but by the time the world wars were done, by the time the Cold War was finished, we understood that there is no one good except God. That should have been the main message we got. So we do need to recognize the weaknesses in our society and ask ourselves, how did they solve these problems in the past? I love to tell the story of Jonathan Swift. You, of course, have read Gulliver's Travels and the floating island. You know, here were these brilliant people who were thinking great thoughts and going to solve all the problems. But in order to create their perfect society, first they had destroyed the whole land that they lived on, and it was a wasteland, and they could do nothing. And so they floated above this wasteland, thinking great thoughts and doing nothing. And to me, this is where I feel our society is today. We've destroyed everything. We don't know how to rebuild it because it's dead and smoking. And we can't solve that problem with the present group of people who are governing and with the present constitution. And for Alberta, that's why I believe it will be a catalyst not just for change for Albertans, but my hope and my prayer for the rest of Canada is it will be a wake-up call that says, hold on a second, we've gone too far.
Yeah.
And we need to turn back to first principles. We need to ask ourselves if maybe the answer is not to become more and more progressive, to tear down more and more of the walls that have supported our society for so long. Perhaps it's time to rebuild. There's a passage in Jeremiah that says, show me the ancient paths that I may walk in them. And to me, that's a touchstone of my life. I want to find that path that careers across the hills and the valleys, that goes over the bridges, over the rivers, that people have been using for generations because you know what? It's the easiest way. And let's get on that path.
Yeah. I think one translation says, stand at the crossroads and look for the ancient way. But anyways, it might be a different passage. You know it way better than me. But you mentioned honor. I was thinking of I believe it was the Finnish prime minister a few back, resigned because he didn't accomplish his promises on healthcare. And I thought, oh man, if we only had that in Canada. You mentioned the debates in Parliament. And again, I can't help thinking this is something that's been on my mind for the last month or so, this issue of tropos and disposition of the people and the nature of the regime. And we seem to have our regime based and built on a number of presuppositions around which the disposition of the people no longer fit. We have, to your point, I know a lot of the people in Parliament. I like them. They're my friends. And maybe they could do what you're saying, give a speech for 2 hours. And maybe nobody could do that. Maybe we don't want anyone to do that. But it does beg the question of tropos and disposition and nature. Anyways, we're at an hour, and I always like to ask people at the end, what have I missed? So we spend this time, I'm asking you questions and feeding off the things that you say, but maybe I've completely gone down a rabbit trail and you're saying, geez, Watley, I wish you would have just raised this issue. We've been batting around it all this whole time and you missed it completely. So what's on your mind? What should I have asked you?
I've just had such a good conversation. I think probably the thing that I would say is you mentioned briefly Civitas, and I would highly encourage everyone to look up Civitas Canada. And if you're not a member and you like deep thinking, it's a society where ideas meet. And obviously, Shawn, you and I both love the society. I'm much newer to it than you are, but I've just fallen completely in love with a group of people who are willing to think. And I think that's probably one of the big things that we need to return to in our society is the ability to think deep thoughts, disagree vociferously, and still be friends at the end of the day. The permission to be honest is necessary, and we've lost that in our society where everyone is so afraid of what people might think and what they might do. And instead, we need to stand up with each other and say, I can walk up to Bruce Party, right, and disagree with him hammer and tongs, and yet respect the guy because he's honest, and this type of dialogue we need more of, and it is, I think, one of the few hopes that we have for our society is to be fundamentally honest. That means owning our failures. I can say boldly and with confidence, I'm a complete and total failure depending on the day. And I'm a jerk. I used to love to say when I was pastoring, guys, just so you know, I'm a jerk. And if I do something jerky, let me know. And we need more of that ability to be honest, especially in the political realm. I get so tired of politicians who stand up there acting as though they're God. When I'm elected, I'm going to do this, and I'm going to do this, and I'm going to do this. And say, no, you're not. I know you're not. You know you're not. Nobody could achieve this. And yet, there is this God complex. There's this idea that we can somehow be fundamentally dishonest with the things that we say and the things that we promise and the way that we're going to present ourselves. And people just have to accept it. It's one of the reasons that we love Ralph out here. We just call him Ralph, right? And you don't even have to add anything further. But Premier Ralph Klein was a great one in Alberta. And he made colossal mistakes. Famously, he one time got drunk and went down and told a bunch of people at a homeless shelter to get a job, you bums. And we all were a little bit surprised, for sure. But he came out the next day and he said, you know what? I've got a drinking problem. I shouldn't have done that. That was stupid. And we all said, fair point, because he was honest with us. He didn't try to spin it. He didn't get his issues management team on it to try and figure out a way to say, well, no, the premier didn't actually do that. It was all a scam. He just came out and said it like it was. And we loved him for it. And he got better ratings after he did that, not because he chewed out a bunch of homeless people, but because he respected us enough to tell us the truth. And for all of us in our lives, as Canadians, we're so afraid of telling the truth because we don't want to offend. There's a way to lovingly speak the truth. There's a way to be honest one to another. There's a way as a society that we can allow each other into our lives without demanding that we all walk in lockstep and agree. And Alberta wouldn't be on the edge of separating. Canada wouldn't be in such a bad spot if we didn't feel that we had to create a perfect lockstep society where everybody speaks and thinks the same thing. And if anybody chooses to step outside of that line, they have to be brutally beaten into the ground.
Yeah, well said. I appreciate the shout out for Civitas too. Yeah, that's certainly close to my heart as well. And just in case people are wondering, Civitas is a society with, I usually say we have libertarians, classical liberals, every kind of conservative, Leocons, social cons, theocons, traditional cons, monarchists. We even have some anarchists there. So really we have everybody coming together on the presupposition that it's important to talk through issues. But then you mentioned honesty, and I was thinking, yeah, but we have to hold it behind closed doors because we're too scared. We're going to lose our jobs if we talk about, I don't know, the definition of marriage or something. So it's funny that there's that juxtaposition. And it also reminded me of Roger Scruton saying conservatism is being honest about the attachments we've inherited and trying to live our lives out in such a way that we align our lives and our behaviors with those attachments. So we can't escape honesty. Anyways, Dr. Rowley, this has been fantastic. I really appreciate you sharing your time today. Look forward to seeing you in Edmonton and can't wait for the next time we get to chat.
Sounds good. Have a good one now.
You too.